We like to imagine the Middle Ages as a mural of torches and banners, iron and prayer, a world where the worst of life arrived on horseback and could be named war-plague taxes. Hunger was subtler. It came on bare feet. It whispered. It rearranged the furniture of the mind until an ordinary crust of bread felt like a cathedral. When harvests failed, people did not tumble straight into the abyss. They descended by steps, 4 of them, if you listen closely enough to the old stories. This was the ladder of hunger, and every rung had its flavour. The first rung was frugality, and it was not dramatic. It looked like thrift, so ordinary that modern eyes might miss it. The loaf was sliced thinner, the broth was lengthened with water, and supper became 2 small meals instead of 1 satisfying one. Mothers shaved the rind off a hard cheese, then scraped the rind again, unwilling to abandon the idea that nourishment might still live in the corners. Bones went back to the pot for a second life, then a third, as if marrow were a promise that just needed more time. The household ledger was not ink on parchment. It was steam rising from a kettle, counted by minutes and hope. If there was sugar here, it was the sweetness of restraint. If there was spice, it was patience. The trick of the first rung was to keep dignity intact while inviting the stomach to negotiate. The second rung was ingenuity. This is where cooks became chemists without vocabulary. Stale bread, which looks like failure in a modern bin, turned into a treasure. Crumbled and simmered it, thickened pottage into something that clung to ribs and memory alike. Onion and leek disguised the age of scraps. Garlic whispered a brave lie that this was a recipe, not an improvisation. A bone that had already given itself to yesterday's soup found itself returned to the boil. Not for meat, there was none, but for the ghosts of meat, the hint of fat that could persuade the body to keep believing. Herbs were used less for taste than for narrative, to tell the mouth a story in which this was still dinner. Ingenuity thrives in corners. Medieval kitchens were an entire education hidden in a corner with a fire. The third rung was desperation, and it tasted like the forest. It tasted like learning the names of plants because the field had fallen silent. Chestnuts went into the millstones and acorns into barrels of water where their bitterness could be coaxed away over days. Bark not the tender outer ribbon, but the inner cambium of pine was scraped, dried ground, then smuggled into dough as if bread could be tricked into being. Pea flour, bean flour mixtures that would appear today in boutique bakeries were then the signatures of crisis. These loaves filled the mouth, but not the body. A full belly is not the same as a nourished one, and medieval people knew this by afternoon when the tremble returned to the hands. Still, the third rung fed villages long enough to reach tomorrow, and in an economy of tomorrows that was a victory. The fourth rung did not speak its name. Every society has a boundary. It draws in words and breaks in private. When famine ran a hard hand through the village, people ate what they had once vowed never to eat. They boiled grass to release a rumour of starch. They trapped what the river gave them when it had no fish to spare. They ate the organs that polite tables once ignored. They took the blood of a butchered animal and made pudding of it dark and dense because blood is an honest food even when the mouth is ashamed. The fourth rung is where the stories are quietest. Yet silence is a historical source too. It tells us how thin the line is between rule and exception when the body is involved. But hunger was not just a menu, it was a calendar and a geography. It had a season and a landscape. It came hardest in the lean months before the new grain could be harvested, when the memory of autumn's abundance made the winter larder feel like a joke told too slowly. It arrived first in households with too many mouths and not enough land in cottages where the only luxury was time to worry. It arrived too in the minds of people who watched the sky, the way we watch screens, who knew that 3 nights of warm wind in late winter could wake wheat too early, inviting frost to murder promises at dawn. If you want to understand the ladder, stand in a one-room cottage at dusk. The hearth is low, but it is honest fire. A child is counting the slices, not because math is a game, but because numbers have become ethics. Someone is sorting herbs on the table nettles, to blanch sorrel, to cut and put at the end so its acid will taste like intention. In a corner, a heel of bread, so hard it could chock. A wheel is soaking in a bowl, turned back into what it once was. Not softness, not luxury, but possibility. Someone jokes there is always one who can make a joke out of fear that the bread used to be heavier, and therefore the family has grown stronger because lifting it once required 2 hands. The laugh is small, but it holds the ceiling up for another evening. Hunger changed the physics of community. It dragged people toward each other, because to eat alone in lean times is heavier than to eat little together. The shared pot on feast days is one thing. The shared pot on famine days is something else. A civic technology that saves fuel and dignity simultaneously. In the shared pot, there was room for the village's ethics to simmer, the first ladle to the oldest, the second to the weakest, and the last ladle, as every child learned to the one who stirred. The simplest ceremony of fairness is a spoon. And yet to live on the ladder was not only to wait for rescue, it was to practice a daily science of making do. Fire became ingredient, not just heat. Smoke became a preservative and a costume, dressing the flavors of age as something intentional. Time became a spice, long simmering, convinced the mouth that thinness was a style. The skills that saved people's lives bore no names grander than keeping an eye on it or not letting it catch. The archive of this knowledge was hands and breath and habit. When we read about famine, we often read numbers. When we listen to famine, we hear stirring. There is a temptation, modern and indulgent, to say that the people who climbed this ladder were pitiable. They were not. They were stubborn. They were experimental in a way that laboratories envy, because the stakes were not grants or praise, but February. A mother who found a way to make nettle soup palatable taught science to her children without a lesson plan. A father who slipped a bit of ground chestnut into dough to stretch a bag of flour another week taught economics without a chart. Hunger, terrible teacher, that it was kept no students who could not improvise. What did it feel like? Like being in a room where the future was an honest guest who could not stay long. On good days, the future shared a bowl. On bad days, it stood by the door, ready to leave if the wind changed. Prayer lived here, but not as a guarantee. It lived as endurance, as the patience to repeat small acts, so modest they can barely be called hope-soaking, simmering, slicing, saving. If faith had a taste in such houses, it tasted like onion simple, tireless, making every other ingredient more itself. So the ladder of hunger is not only a descent, it is also a way up, one rung at a time, through acts that did not feel heroic while they were happening. The first rung teaches that restraint is a kind of wealth. The second proves that skill can disguise scarcity without lying. The third admits the world into the kitchen, the woods, the bark, the weeds, and asks it to sit at the table. The fourth confesses that ethics must eat too, and that sometimes they do. None of this is clean. All of it is human. By the time we leave this cottage and step into the night, we understand that tomorrow's meal will have to be invented again. The sky will remain its own lord. The fields will answer or refuse. But the pot is there, and so are the hands that know what to do with very little. The candle flame wobbles when we open the door. The room inhales. The ladder remains against the wall where everyone can reach it. And that, more than any law or sermon, is how people survived long enough to tell us what hunger taught them. The field in theory is honest. You put seed in, you labor, you wait, and what you planted returns multiplied. That is the promise of farming in a sentence written on every calendar. But promises are only as reliable as the signatures beneath them, and the Middle Ages learned again and again that the weather does not sign its name. The harvest was a gamble, and the house cold wet or strangely warm almost always had the advantage. Imagine a year that begins kindly. Winter loosens its grip a week early, persuading hopeful people to hitch the plough before the saints' days say they should. The ground looks willing. Oxen pull men and women set rhythm with their steps, and their breath, the furrows lie in neat ribs across the body of the earth. Seeds go in. The village shares a mood that can only be called polite joy, not celebration, just the relief of doing what ought to be done. Then comes rain that does not know how to stop. It is not a storm which would be dramatic and helpful to memory. It is a persistence, days and nights, of soft ruin. Low fields turn to mirrors. The grain drowns, not with a shout, but with a gurgle. The track to the mill becomes a canal of brown. The thatch sighs. The word soon migrates from sentence to sentence. Soon it will break. Soon the water will run off. Soon we'll be past this. When soon fails, the arithmetic of the year begins to bend, or reverse the cruelty. Imagine a sky that becomes stingy. A wind without moisture combs the fields until the soil lifts in sheets and moves as if the land itself were emigrating. Seedlings harden into green wire and then give up the idea of height. Wells taste like coins. Bread shrinks in the mind before it shrinks on the table, because the mind knows what a dry June means long before July arrives. People stand in their doorways and become theologians of air. If only someone says, if only is the most human weather. There were frosts, 2 sneaking streaks of winter across spring like chalk on a slate. Wheat can be tricked. A few warm days in February teach the plant to believe. A clear, glittering dawn in March teaches it to repent. The worst damage is quiet. Internal cells burst tenderness, turns to glass. The future blackens in threads along the veins of leaves. Experienced farmers read frost like a physician reads a pulse. They do not panic. They make lists. Panic comes later when the lists run out. Disease was weather's accomplice. Rust turned wheat leaves into powdery script, writing a language of failure that everyone could read. Smut made grains into sacks of dark dust. Ergo the sly fungus hid in rye and took its revenge on human nervous systems, months later with tingling limbs, burning skin visions. The same loaf that spared a family today could make them tremble tomorrow. It is hard to stay rational when your daily bread is in dialogue with your nerves. Economies amplify the sky. When grain fails, price does not just rise, it leaps. Urban rumour becomes a second climate system, blowing scarcity from street to street. Bread its size, weight, and price has laws, at least in many towns. Bakers must obey the assize. The loaf becomes lighter when grain is dear, heavier when it is cheap. The scale briefly tries to be justice, but justice cannot be eaten. People count slices, not statutes. The baker who follows the rule is still the face of bad news. It is not flattering to be the person who sells smaller hope. The great famine of 1317 is a grim teacher. Rain cold and a sequence of ungenerous seasons combined with exhausted soils and crowded populations. Cattle died in mudseed, rotted famine, spread like mold in a barrel. We remember it because the records are loud chroniclers, clerks, and priests, all writing at once trying to keep literature ahead of hunger, but also because it made patterns visible. It showed how vulnerable a Europe of small margins could be and how social life responds when margins disappear. The first response is migration across small distances. Young men leave villages to find day wages in towns because coin seems safer than crops that might fail again. Young women follow seasonal labour to manors where a lord's granary is a rumour of stability. The village thins in a way you can measure by sound, fewer voices at dusk, fewer hands at harvest, fewer weddings. Weddings matter in this arithmetic because they knit food to future. Postponed vows are rationed love. Then come the crimes that do not feel like crimes to the people committing them. A cart of grain tips not because the road is rutted, but because a rope was cut. Fields get gleaned at night by those who do not have the right to glean. The community argument begins. Is survival theft when the owner is a granary with a lord around it? The answer depends on who is holding the ladder to the loft. Ethics in scarcity take on the smell of whatever is in the sack. Authorities are not blind. Some lords open their stores because history has taught them that food is cheaper than soldiers. Some do not, and discover that a pitchfork is an excellent tool for moving hay and for moving history. Town councils publish rules that try to spread hunger, thinly market days, limited exports, prohibited bakers, supervised. Priests declare fasts that are not really fasts because the calendar and the cupboard finally agree. Monasteries, when they are good at being monasteries, become reservoirs, cheese, wheels, salted fish, barrels of ale, doled out by measure and prayer. Underneath these visible acts is the silent genius of diversification. The smartest communities do not plant one grain, they hedge. Barley here, rye there, oats on soil that only oats forgive. They stagger sowing times by a week or two, so a single bad frost will not shave the year clean. They keep a meadow that can be turned to tillage in an emergency, a small bet placed against the future's bad mood. They breed resilience into habit, which is the best place for it to live. And yet the gamble is not just agronomy and price, it is emotion. The feeling of working for months on fields that may not pay you is as specific as a smell, wet, straw, iron. A little sourness of sweat inside wool. To continue to work under that cloud to repair a fence the river might take again tomorrow is not optimism or its opposite. It is a discipline. Medieval life made a craft of continuing. Children learn early what the sky costs. They are told not to waste crumbs. The lesson is not moralizing so much as mathematics. They are taught the taste of different years, the thin broth year, the fat bacon year, the nettle year. And they build a vocabulary in which food is a calendar. Old people are archives. They remember the last time the river did this, the last time the bees swarmed late, the pattern in the wind, that means hail. The harvest gamble is intergenerational science, hypotheses, data, gossip, songs. We like to ask whether people were superstitious. It is a poor question when the stakes are bread. Of course, there were prayers for rain and for the cessation of rain processions and charms and the placing of saints' images where clouds could see them. Prayer here is not an attempt to bend physics so much as to bend fear. It gathers people, aligns their breath, gives a name to the thing no one can control. In a world without forecasts, a hymn is a kind of forecast tomorrow we will still be together. If we step back from one village and look at many, the pattern sharpens. Famine is not every year and everywhere. It is a rhythm, a terrible backbeat under the melody of ordinary seasons. 4 or 5 good harvests, 1 bad. Sometimes the bad is modest. a lean season that teaches thrift. Sometimes it is grand and cruel, a punctuation mark that turns sentences into exclamations. People arrange their lives around this rhythm the way sailors arrange their work around tides. You cannot cancel the tide. You can only know it intimately. And that knowledge, unwritten local, persistently tested, is the only advantage the gambler ever has. The Middle Ages did not win every year. They could not. But they learned to reduce the size of losing. The hedge of mixed grains, the wisdom of when to sow the habit of drying a little fish, when fish are many, the courtesy of a shared pot when they are few. These are small strategies that, taken together, buy time. In a game where the prize is simply reaching another October, time is fortune. When we call the harvest a gamble, we risk insulting the players. Gambling sounds like play. This was not play. It was a calendar written in hunger and relief, a ledger balanced with sweat and sleep lost to worry. If there was a lucky charm, it was not carved bone in a pocket. It was the sober ritual of doing the right small thing, again and again when the sky did not care. The fields could betray you. The village, if it was wise, would not. When the field fell silent, the forest spoke. It did not shout, it listed. It named its wares the way a careful shopkeeper names: inventory, nettle, sorrel, dandelion, goosefoot, chickweed, ground elder, plantain, wild garlic. People who lived at the edge of trees were bilingual, one language for crops and contracts another for leaves and shadows. Foraging was not a hobby. It was what you did when the granary felt like an empty church. The first lesson was seasonal grammar. Spring was soft and green nettles before they stung too hard sorrel with its clean lemon-edge ramsons that made the lane smell like a kitchen, even in the open air. Children learned to fold nettle leaves backward to keep the stings hidden, then blanch them in the pot until they forgot their cruelty. Chickweed and goosefoot padded out pottage, their mildness a blessing on weary mouths. Dandelion leaves young and still sweet, acted like a tonic that no apothecary needed to bless. Summer offered confidence. Berries woke up blackberries with their thirst-quenching dribble down the chin. Raspberries in hedgerows, bilberries up on sour heaths where grain would never agree to grow. Hazel promised green nuts that would dry into winter's patience. The ground itself suggested roots if you knew where to look: burdock with its deep earthy anchor, pignut whose crispy bulb you traced by gently following a thread-like stem with 2 careful fingers, wild carrot, which was delicious when true and dangerous when mistaken for hemlock's pale impersonations. No one ever foraged alone without the voice of an elder in their head smell, examine the stem, test the leaf look again. Autumn was the grand isle. Massed years came like festivals: beechnuts, acorns, chestnuts, hazelnuts, fat, oily syllables that could be spoken as breakfast all winter if managed wisely. Acorns required patience, and water cracked, soaked, rinsed, soaked again. The bitterness, leaving like a stubborn tenant. Chestnuts were easier a gift to mills when grain was scarce. Families spread nuts in attic baskets, turned them with their hands, listened for the rattle that meant dry and safe. Mushrooms asked for reverence and restraint. A chanterelle's apricot glow and a sep's sturdy confidence could deceive the greedy into filling baskets faster than judgment. The forest keeps its assassins close to its saints, the deathcap's deceitful elegance, the destroying angel's perfect robe. We do not guess with mushrooms, grandmothers said, and no one argued with women who carried decades of autumns in their memory. Winter was a conservatory, not a feast. The forest, then, was less about gathering and more about custody. What you had dried had to remain dry. What you had smoked had to remain aloof from damp. What you had hung had to be safe from nibbling neighbours with whiskers. Still, the stream that refused to freeze entirely might offer watercress, whose peppered bite could wake a tired system, and the hedge might still let go a handful of hips, orange and puckered small lanterns, rich in what later ages would call vitamins. Foraging had a map, but it wasn't drawn, it was performed. Villages divided woods by custom, not fences. A family might walk the North Copse on first Sundays and the East Creek on third Wednesdays. There was a gentleman's agreement without gentlemen: don't strip a patch bald. Don't take the first you see or the last. Always leave seed and a future. Violators were corrected without ceremony by a conversation that felt like weather everywhere and inescapable. Songs and riddles stored the data. If the leaf says spear and the smell says leek, the ground will feed you this week. A child sang it, and a cousin lived another month because of it. Tools were modest and perfect. A billhook hung on a belt where a lord might hang a dagger. A small knife honed so often it was mostly memory-made clean cuts to invite regrowth. Baskets were the opposite of decoration. Willow ribs, curved to fit shoulders. A strap crossing the chest so hands stayed free for caution. In some houses, a finger-length sliver of horn, smooth with years of checking caps, was considered part of the family, like a pet. The craft was in how you moved as much as in what you cut, slow feet, eyes tuned, to shade a pause before harvest, to let the brain catch up to the mouth's enthusiasm. Honey was forest salary. Beekeeping in skeps woven straw domes was a collaboration between fear and desire. Honey sweetened medicine and bribed children to eat what the pot required. Wax wrote notes to the night in candles. Wild hives were tracked by beelining, watching the flight path of foragers and walking their geometry into the trees. A marriage of patience and angle. The finder sometimes took all, but the wise took only what winter could spare and left the rest. Because cruelty to bees is arrogance against springs you have not met yet. Birds were not just songs. Eggs in certain seasons stood in for meat that never arrived. Here the forest enforced a different law. Take some, not all. Never strip a nest to the bone of hope. Snails were gathered too, their shells clacking softly in bags, like a polite market. They were fed on clean herbs to sweeten their flesh before the pot. If a stream cut the wood eels and frogs, could become fasting day food, with the legitimacy of tradition. The line between forest and water blurred in such places cattail, rhizomes, flower, if you knew how to be patient string, if you didn't. Risk was not abstract. Misidentification killed. Hemlock is not parsley, but loves to be mistaken for it. Foxglove's handsome leaves look like comfrey to the inattentive. The heart notices the confusion later. Even safe plants can betray when the soil is wrong, when a ditch has been fouled by tannery runoff, when the meadow has enjoyed a night of a shepherd's careless dump. Foragers learn to read not just the plant, but its neighbours, the way a musician reads a score by looking ahead. You harvested the company, the plant kept as much as the plant itself. Preservation completed the art. Mushrooms sliced thin and threaded on twine, hung from rafters and clicked in the drafts like little castanets. Berry pulp spread across linen screens in late sun became leathery sweets that children could chew in February while a story was told. Nuts were ground and pressed between wooden plates to bleed their oil. The precious sheen rubbed into bread like a dream of butter. A corner of the room smelled like vinegar, where pickles of hedgerow greens would argue with meals all winter. Forest food did not just arrive, it stayed on purpose. Foraging redistributed status. The forest did not care about Latin or land titles. It honoured practice. An old woman with steady knees and a lifetime of seasons could feed a dozen with knowledge a young man's strength could not replace. Children were not surplus labor. They were scouts and memory. They had a height advantage. The world closest to the ground belongs to small people. Men carried women, judged though everyone crossed lines when the basket demanded it. What looked like wandering was work, and what looked like idleness. Someone sitting with a plant for a long time was research. Trade hummed at the margins. A widow with 4 jars of dried bilberries might swap one for a pound of barley, or a promise written in the honest ink of a neighbour's voice, help at harvest if harvest happens. A family with chestnut flour could stretch another family's dwindling wheat into Sunday bread. The priest's kitchen sometimes smelled like a compromise between doctrine and appetite, when a parishioner brought a gift that could not be refused without insulting hunger itself. It is tempting to romanticize this, to turn the forest into a benevolent godparent and the foragers into woodland saints. That would be incorrect. The forest is not kind. It is consistent. It rewards attention and punishes haste. It allows you to make a living if you do not attempt to make a killing. It forgives, but slowly. The generosity people attribute to forests is often the reflection of their own discipline. What the forest did give beyond calories and bitterness to be washed away was a way of being together. Walking out in a line at dawn, baskets at hips, exchanging signals with hands and quiet whistles, the village became a moving classroom. The curriculum included humility. You do not command a mushroom to appear. It included accountability, take what you can, process, leave what you cannot. It included gratitude, practiced not as a word, but as the careful act of not ruining tomorrow. By the time the sun turned the understory to gold, you knew whether the day was good or merely adequate. Adequate days were victories in lean years. The path home was slower. Baskets bite into shoulders differently when full. The ache is an argument in favour of continuing. At the cottage, nettles gave up their sting to boiling water. Berries bled into pots. Nuts rattled the way. Money does in other economies. The pot welcomed the forest the way a host welcomes guests by making room. And if tonight the soup tasted more of leaf than of fat, no one complained. Leaves too are a kind of promise. Tomorrow would ask for the river and the shore for patience with tides and traps. The forest had told its truth: we can help you if you help us survive you. When the forest had done what it could, people turned to water. Rivers do not keep larders the way barns do, but they hold a calculus of their own flows and eddies, seasons and temperatures, the private habits of fish and the public moods of tides. The poor learned to read water with the same literacy they applied to weather and soil. If the field was a ledger and the forest an oral library, the river was a moving classroom, with no walls and no patience for inattention. Begin upstream, where hills nurse streams into youth. Here in spring and early summer, water runs cold enough to keep itself honest. Minnows and small trout flicker in light like stolen knives. Children learn to cup their hands downstream of stones, to let the current do the shepherding. A wicker trap set overnight at the mouth of a side brook may wake in the morning with silver punctuation marks alive within it, enough to turn broth from apology to statement. Frogs are in some seasons what a church calendar might call legitimate. You could fast and still be fed. Eels, those muscular question marks of the river, taught villagers cunning. By moonless nights, men lowered wicker eel pots into weed-dark channels. By dawn, the pots answered with protein. Further down, the river slows and fattens, becoming an argument with its own banks. Here stand fish weirs, triangles of stakes driven deep, their openings positioned like logic problems in the path of the current. Fish follow the flow into the V and discover only baskets at the narrow end. Building a weir is carpentry and geometry, and permission from those whose grandfathers' axes claimed the right to interrupt the river. The weir is not a wall. It is a conversation between hunger and migration. It is checked in the half-light before day begins in earnest, because fish, kept too long in the trap, begin to mean less. The river brings gifts beyond its meat. Watercress clings to mouths of springs, peppering winter, with green that feels medicinal to bodies dulled by starch. Reeds and rushes provide cordage and mats lines for hanging fish ropes, for holding traps against a sulking current. Willow gives itself to basketry and to the small repeated miracles of repair. A fisherman's hands lined with work can splice a broken hoop the way a scribe repairs a torn page. Nets are patched at thresholds with gossip as thread. A boat that leaks less today is an announcement that someone in the house has both skill and a little time. Salt is the river's partner, waiting patiently at the place where fresh meets brine. For families near estuaries and coasts, low tide redraws the pantry. When the sea withdraws, it does not go empty-handed. It leaves behind cockles, mussels, limpets, periwinkles, crabs hiding under weed, draped stones. Children are the best harvesters because the world at low tide is scaled to their knees and curiosity. A practiced hand twists a limpet free. An impatient hand breaks shell and pride together. Seaweed, which people of the interior sometimes scorn as a food of desperation, is a coastal plural dulse, with its wine-dark fronds eaten dried like a savoury parchment laver, boiled down to black velvet, and rolled with oats or spread on. Bread. The tide teaches time twice a day. We go now, or we do not go at all. Preservation turns water's brief abundance into winter's argument. Fish are salted layered between crystals, harvested from pans where seawater has been bullied by sun and wind into confession. Salting is math disguised as alchemy too little, and rot writes its own history too much, and the flesh becomes a lesson in regret. Where forests are generous with wood smoke, is enlisted racks over slow fires, lift fish into a longer future, teaching them to taste of memory and fuel. The smell of a smokehouse is a thesis about continuity. In some places, fish are wind-dried on lines until their weight announces safety in the hand. The poor become curators of protein, their galleries small and essential. Tides and seasons sculpt the work. Herring seasons arrive like parades. When a shoal comes close, even a poor village can feel wealthy in the way that matters work, that is not futile. Nets come in heavy shoulders, burn friendly children laugh as they chase what falls and flaps on the shingle. In lean years, such days make people almost superstitious about gratitude, as if too much thanks might spook the sea into taking it all back. There are saints for storms and saints for fishermen. Prayers hang in the salt air like more nets. Bring them in and bring them home, someone says softly at the edge of the beach, and no one thinks it foolish. Not all waters are generous. Some rivers sulk with silt, some coasts hide a hunger of their own in treacherous sands and unpredictable waves. There are years when shellfish carry invisible sickness, when a cluster of households fall ill in a way no recipe can explain. Knowledge evolves like a shoreline, slowly, with occasional violent corrections. A village that has lost elders to bad mussels develops a cautionary chorus that children repeat without understanding until the day they do. Only after frost, or only where the weed is clean, or never from that bend after heavy rain. The rules of water are precise and local and merciless toward forgetfulness. Access to water is politics too. Weirs require permission, nets require space. Salt pans require land and fuel. Lords claim rights to fish certain stretches. Monasteries claim others. Towns claim harbours and levy dues. The poor navigate not only currents but jurisdictions, learning that a wrong day at a wrong reach can cost not only a catch, but coin or favor. Yet water also dissolves boundaries in a way the field does not. A flood ignores a charter. In disaster, even a lord's horse lifts its skirts. Afterward, someone from the manor might stand by a smashed bridge and remember that he eats fish too. The social physics of water resemble those of the forest in one important way. Mastery belongs to practice. A quiet man who can smell rain upriver may feed his neighbours more reliably than a loud one with fine tackle. A woman who knows exactly when the tide will turn without looking at the moon can dismiss a roomful of confident guesses with a lifted eyebrow. Attention is a distributable wealth. So is patience. Eel pots baited with nights dark require someone to prefer dawn to sleep. Shellfish pulled from the mud require someone to rinse and rinse again and to trust that clarity is not a metaphor. Inland ponds made by lords for fish stews, they were called give their own ration of predictability. Carp and pike do not read the weather in quite the same furious accent as herring do. A steward who manages ponds with art can provide Friday fish for years, a liturgical diet secured by mud and management. Such places are not the poor's first resort, but their existence alters the arithmetic of scarcity in a district. When a monastery's ponds gleam under thin winter sun, the village can see reserves without touching them, which is a complicated comfort. Water changes the flavour of community. Work crews form around nets, and boats around smokehouse, fires around salt pans. Songs take on the rhythm of haul and coil of lift and lower. This is not romance. It is labour's way of meeting time on equal terms. The old teach the young to coil ropes the same way every time, because in the dark, a snarl is a hazard, and in daylight a snarl is lost. Hours which are calories, a body will not have. A well-coiled rope is a moral statement in a world that eats carelessness. The table answers. A day with fish is a day when the pot speaks. In bigger words, stew thickened with barley broth, brightened with watercress, bread spread with a paste of pounded dulse and a little fat. Shellfish are steamed with nettles, because nettles are what there is, and because their sting is a memory lesson for fingers that will be careful next time. Children learn to pry limpets and to chew without theatrics. Blood pressure is a term for later centuries. Here, there is only the sensation of salt returning to a body that has needed it. And then there are days without. Nets come up empty, except for weed and an invented dignity. A trap is sprung and says nothing. The weir yields one fish that looks like an apology wearing scales. On such days, poor people practice the spiritual discipline of not cursing the visible world. You tend to gear. You invent reasons why the failure is temporary. You eat a little of what was saved, and you tell children stories about plenty that are careful not to sound like lies. Tomorrow, the tide will be different by exactly the amount it always is. Water does not love the hungry or hate them. It moves. It keeps its own time. It requires acknowledgement rather than trust. Medieval people learned to give it that, and in return they receive not certainty, but a list of methods that, when applied with humility, often worked. Eels in the dark, mussels on the retreating line of foam, a weir tended before speeches can be made, a rack of herring turning smoke into February food, a salt pan scraped and scraped again until crystals sing under the palm. Enough to live, and then to live again. Bread is not only food in the Middle Ages, it is grammar. Meals are sentences that feel unfinished without it. A table with meat and no bread is an argument. A table with bread and little else is a promise. Which is why the most disorienting part of famine is not hunger itself, but the collapse of this grammar. When grain fails, language must be reinvented, and kitchens begin to conjugate bread out of things that were never meant to be bread at all. Chestnuts were the friendliest imposter. In upland regions where chestnut groves stood like parishioners, autumn laid down a brown carpet that could be swept into sacks and futures. The nuts were dried on slatted lofts, over slow heat smoke drifting up through cracks, keeping mould shy, and later ground between stones into a meal that smelled faintly of campfire and rain. Chestnut bread is honest about not being wheat. It is denser, slightly sweet, more cake than loaf, but it slices it, toasts. It carries soup into the body, the way a ferry carries people across a river. A household with chestnut flour could soften the blow of a failed harvest. They could be poor without feeling betrayed by their own tables. Acorns required faith and a basin. Raw they grip the mouth with bitterness, as if trying to hang on. But leached, cracked, crushed, then soaked and rinsed and soaked again. Until the water runs clear, they surrender their stubborn chemistry and become mild enough to grind. The work is long, the result uncertain until it isn't, and along the way you learn to read water the way you read faces. This batch needs one more night. That one is ready now. Mixed with a little real flour, if any can be found, or with chestnut meal if it cannot acorn. Dough bakes into loaves that are more philosophy than pleasure. They affirm that bread is also a verb. To bread is to make something carry you. Peas and beans came to the rescue, as if the field had remembered its manners. Dried and milled, they made flours of humble protein that tinted dough with a pale green or beige, and weighted it with a legume's honest heft. Pea bread could be brickish if treated like wheat, but treated like itself, moistened, given time, paired with fat or whey. It became what it was supposed to be, a filling, faintly grassy platform for stews that had more broth than substance. In some kitchens, pea flour was whisked into boiling water to make a porridge that pretended to be a sauce for bread that pretended to be bread. Pretending here was not deception, it was choreography. Everything was trying to help everything else across the meal. There were darker arts. Bark bread has an unfortunate poetry to it, and it is not all legend. Hungry people in lean forests learned to shave the inner cambium of pine and birch, thin, pale ribbons that dry quickly and can be ground to adulterate small hoards of flour. No one praised the flavour. The praise, if any, was for the arithmetic. A pound of wheat ground with bark might make 2 loaves, where one would otherwise taunt a family with its singularity. The mouth knows the crime. It tastes forest where field should be. Yet winter has no court for such trials. The verdict is survival or not. Between chestnut groves and bark, there lies a broad territory of substitutions. Barley extended with ground oats, rye stretched with pea, wheat, if a miracle occurred, made to go further with anything that would not revolt in the oven. In the far north and high valleys lichens, Icelandic moss entered the repertoire after careful boiling to tame their bitterness. In coastal places, seaweed dried and powdered found its way into dough as a mineral whisper that reminded the mouth of the shore. These were not foods of pride, they were foods of persistence, the culinary equivalent of wearing a coat inside the house. Detoxification was a household science. Mothers knew the water changes by heart acorns to be leached in a running stream, if possible in many changes of still water, if not. Lichens to be parboiled and rinsed until their stubbornness lifted, bitter almonds, where they grew to be handled with a caution that was almost liturgical. There was an ethics to this science as well. Do not pass on a half-taught method. A neighbour who forgets the last soak is not merely forgetful, she is endangered. Knowledge was charity that tasted like bread. Grinding mattered. Mills that had laughed through fat years at wheat's soft compliance discovered that chestnuts jam and pulses clump. Millers adapted with sieves of different mesh, with patient cleaning, with the practiced flick of the wrist that keeps meal moving. In houses too far from mills, or too poor for their tollstones, did the work in laps 2 rocks and a rhythm. Children learn to sit and turn and sing the same little song because songs make circles easier. The dust they breathed had a different smell each season, sweet for chestnut, grassy for pea, earnest for rye. Years could be identified by a sneeze. Baking changed shape. True loaves need gluten's architecture to rise into foam and crumb. Substitute flours have other talents. Doughs became flatter or were poured rather than kneaded, sliding into pans slicked with oil or smeared with fat when fat could be spared. Griddles saw more use cakes and flatbreads cooked against iron's patient heat, flipped with knives that were also used to cut twine and gossip. Oven days shifted from the village bakehouse to the private hearth, when what you had to bake did not deserve the cost of a shared firing. Smell still gathered the street, though. Even bark bread begs noses closer. Debate warmed the benches on cold evenings. What is bread? Is it the grain, the shape, the work, the blessing? A conservative would say wheat. A pragmatist would say anything sliceable that carries soup. A theologian might suggest that bread is what a community agrees to break together. In lean years, definitions widened because definitions are luxury goods. A family that has eaten chestnut loaves all winter is in no mood to be told in June that they were not eating bread. Language bends around survival. Nutrition was a saboteur, even when hunger seemed soothed. Many substitutes filled the stomach, without giving the body enough iron, or the right B vitamins, or the slow sweetness that keeps hands steady all afternoon. People learned to notice the difference between a meal that silences complaint and a meal that powers work. Solutions crept in at the edges, a splash of whey in the dough, an egg when hens consented, a smear of rendered fat under the crust, herbs and wild greens chopped into batter for minerals as much as for morale. The poor do not count calories. They count afternoons without fainting. From a modern vantage, some of this looks oddly fashionable. Chestnut flour today sits on tidy shelves in tidy bags with tidy labels. Bean breads and oat loaves are sold with pride to people who have never known bark except as decoration. This irony is not a crime, but it should be handled with respect. What appears as choice now was constraint then. A chestnut cake served at a festive table, sweetened with honey and perfumed with rosemary, is a descendant of desperation dressed for company. It is good to know the lineage of pleasure. The politics of substitution were not simple. Lords who controlled mills could control what counted as acceptable grain to grind, taking toll in kind from flour that had taken days to prepare. Towns enforced rules about adulteration meant to protect buyers from fraud, and also conveniently to police the poor out of markets. A loaf stretched with pea flour might be legal if labelled illegal if not, and the penalty was paid in coin the poor did not have, or in shame the poor could not spare. Meanwhile, at home, the same mixture was celebrated as ingenuity. Market and hearth have never agreed entirely on the meaning of food, and still people made bread. They made it stubbornly daily as right and routine. A mother patting a flat cake into shape with wet palms in order to keep it from cracking is performing craft and theatre. She is convincing the dough and the watching children that this is still the old story, the one where bread arrives and the meal makes sense. A father returning from the forest with a sack of nuts is a mill in shoes. An old neighbour stopping by to suggest one more rinse for the acorns is peer review. The air in the cottage, warm with steam and effort, smells like a small argument with despair that the family seems to be winning. In the end, bread from not bread is a study in humility and reach. It admits that the field has failed and dares to suggest that the world beyond the field tree nutweed lichen tide can step in awkwardly but effectively to hold the place of wheat. It is not a triumph, but it is a bridge. And a bridge, even a narrow one, is the difference between this winter and next spring. Waste is a modern vice. In the Middle Ages, it was a fantasy. Food was not a sequence of courses, it was a sequence of chances. You did not ask what to cook, you asked what could be made again. In hungry years, the kitchen's highest art was resurrection, giving yesterday a second life, then a third, until the memory of the original ingredient had been stretched into usefulness. If bread was grammar, resurrection, cooking was syntax, the order and emphasis that made short sentences feel complete. The pot was the altar of this practice. A good pot dark, with years of flame, offered continuity. Into it went the ends of onions, the bones that had already been visited by teeth, the heel of bread that could defeat a knife, the herb stalks that smelled like a promise even after their leaves had departed. Water arrived with humility and left with purpose. Long simmering convinced collagen to surrender starches, to soften the stubborn to yield. Skimming was not vanity, it was health. Scum removed meant fewer off flavors, fewer arguments with the belly later. The surface of a pot was a mirror in which a careful cook read the future of the meal. Stale bread was not an insult, it was a toolkit. Crumbs thickened, slices floated, and soaked as sops the old word that lives on inside supper. A trencher yesterday's loaf cut into a bowl held stew during the meal and became part of it at the end, a literal eating of the bowl that left no dish to wash and no scrap to mourn. When the family had nothing worth calling, broth bread went first to hot water, then to a little fat or ale, then to herbs. By the time it reached the table, it had been persuaded into meaning more than it was. No one praised it, but no one refused it. Bones were libraries. The first boil gave soup, the second stole what the first had missed, the third whispered to the joints and made them loosen. A shin of beef that a rich man would have discarded had chapters left for a poor kitchen. Time and acidity were the keys, a splash of vinegar or verjuice. The sour juice pressed from unripe grapes or crab apples tempted calcium into the pot and brightness into the tongue. Even families that never saw pepper learned to balance fat with sour as if they had read books on it. Vinegar was cheap scholarship. The kitchen worked in orders rather than recipes. Order 1 boil bones and onion trimmings for a broth. Order 2 strain and keep the liquid, pick the bones for shreds that can masquerade as meat. Return what is picked to the pot with grains, barley, oats, or with peas that have been soaking and hoping. Order 3, thicken. Thickening was the peasant's alchemy. Breadcrumbs ground oats a fist of mashed root. Even the milk-sour whey, ladled from a cheese-making day, each turned thin resolve into real sustenance. Egg yolk, when available, made a poor man's liaison beaten with a little hot soup and whisked back into the pot off the boil so it would not curdle into regret. Flavour did not come from exotic powders. It came from architecture, the way leeks and onions are softened slowly, so their sweetness becomes the floor the meal stands on. The way sage, thyme, savoury parsley are used not as performances, but as quiet corrections. The way mustard, a common seed pounded with a little vinegar, gives the poor person's heat. Garlic was courage. It said to the nose, "This is supper." It said to doubt, "Go wait by the door." Fat was a currency saved and spent. A small jar of dripping rendered from a rare roast or collected from a pot's rim sat like treasure in the coolest corner. A spoon of it under a crust could turn a loaf into a memory of feast days. A spoon in a pottage could still the house's complaints with a silk that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with technique. When there was no fat to spare, cooks reached for emulsions by accident, a little flour whisked with liquid, or a paste of breadcrumbs, and ale beaten until the broth accepted the bargain. Fuel scarcity shaped flavour, as surely as hunger did. Wood and peat were not to be wasted. Coals were banked and encouraged to behave. A cook who knew her fire could hold a pot at a grateful tremble all afternoon while she did other labour mending, minding, teaching small hands to sort lentils from tiny stones. Some houses practiced a kind of retained heat cooking pots, nestled into ash or into a box of straw after a good boil, letting trapped warmth finish the work without eating fuel. The flavour this gave soft beyond softness, edges, rounded starches married to broth, was not an accident. It was economics turned into tenderness. Resurrection reached beyond pots. Pickle brines returned to the table as seasoning. The cloudy liquor from last month's cucumbers brightened turnips in the pan. Cheese, whey, watered gardens, but first starred in porridges, lending body and a sour milk kindness. Brassica stems, cabbage ribs, and kale spines were shaved thin and cooked long a lesson in how texture can be convinced to behave. Onion skins dyed both wool and soup, the latter a trick few would admit, but many practiced. Colour reassures even when taste does not notice. There was a rumour repeated from valley to valley of the everlasting stew, a pot that never quite cooled, that received scraps and gave suppers without clear beginning or end. Whether any cottage kept such a pot forever is less important than the principle it advertised continuity is edible. In many houses, a lesser version existed, a broth from yesterday to kept over a low ember enriched today, divided tonight, then left with just enough life to accept tomorrow's additions. If the word culture means what we hand on, then this was culinary culture, in the literal sense, a living medium into which new life was fed. The parable of the stone soup belonged here as a social technology. A traveller offers a stone to boil the village, adds a turnip, someone surrenders a bone, another, a handful of barley, and the miracle is not that stone makes soup, but that pretext makes cooperation. In lean seasons, pretexts are sacred. A real village did not need a stranger's story to cook together, but stories help people remember what they already know. A shared pot saves fuel, multiplies taste, and distributes dignity. You bring what you can, and no one measures your poverty aloud. Hearth management was choreography. Trivets lifted pots to the right height. Hooks lowered them to the honest royal that extracts rather than smashes. Small stones ringed the fire to warm bowls before serving so thin soups would not surrender their heat to cold clay. The order of cooking aligned with the order of day broth, first at dawn grains, mid-morning greens, in late afternoon. So they kept their colour and courage. When there was a scrap of meat, it was introduced late and gently, so its presence sang rather than shouted, and so its absence could be borne tomorrow. Safety lived in these orders. Boiling was not superstition, it was policy. Milk was scalded. Dubious water was convinced with heat to be less ambitious. Leftovers were reboiled to innocence before service. Sourness, vinegar, verjuice, pickle brine was encouraged because sour resists spoilage, and because sour makes hunger honest. People who lacked thermometers kept time with prayer lengths, song verses, the number of stirs it takes to tell a small story twice. Accuracy took the form of habit. When rare sweetness appeared, a spoon of honey, a few dried apples, a raisin, or two filched from a priest's larder, it was used not to decorate, but to reconcile. A trace of sweet in a sour stew quieted arguments the tongue might have started and made a child forgive a pot that looked unkind. The poor learned the medieval love of sweet and sour from the ground up without imported spices or courtly recipes. Vinegar and honey could do the work of cinnamon and sugar if you asked them politely and heated them long enough together to become friends. What did resurrection cooking give besides calories? It gave agency. In a world where the sky played dice with fields, the hearth played chess. Each small move saving a crust, skimming a pot, returning bones for one more hour, whisking whey into a sulking soup, was a way to act to refuse the role of spectator. It taught attention as a virtue watch, the simmer, listen for the new sound. When a broth changes its mind smell, for the moment garlic stops being sharp and becomes generous. It taught memory, which dumplings hold together with oat instead of wheat, which herbs stay kind, after long cooking, which bowl cracks if you look at it wrong. At table, resurrection tasted like continuity, and sometimes that is all a family needs. The first ladleful might be thin, the second thicker with bread, the third brightened by a dash of brine, saved for the purpose. A cook could look down the bench and know that for tonight the argument with hunger had been postponed. Tomorrow would come with its questions and its arithmetic. The pot would answer again with sentences made from fragments, with comfort made from skill, with a kind of stubborn grace that makes poor kitchens into places of learning. Nothing in these rooms was wasted. Not the crust, not the bone, not the breath used to blow ash from a coal before nestling the pot back into its cradle. Resurrection cooking did not pretend to be feasting. It pretended to be enough, and it kept its promise often enough to be believed. Fresh food is a promise with a short fuse. Preservation lengthens the wick. In lean years, the quiet sciences of salt-acid time and cooperation turned perishable abundance into patient food calories that weighted vitamins that did not flee at the first frost protein banked like coin. Medieval people did not have thermometers or textbooks, but they had barrels, cellars, palates, and the stubborn curiosity required to notice what kept and what betrayed. Out of that noticing came miracles you could eat. Cheese is the most famous of these, not because it is glamorous, but because it is docile. It lets itself be carried across seasons. Milk, hot-breathed, and brief becomes curd, then curd becomes wheel, and a wheel becomes a calendar you can taste. The first steps feel like magic to a newcomer milk warmed to blood heat. A bit of yesterday's rennet or sour whey, persuading it to gather and separate to make a floating landscape of white islands in a yellow sea. Hands slip in and break the curds to rice-sized pieces, or thumb-sized, depending on what the house knows and wants. Heat returns gentle but insistent, and the curds tighten. They are scooped into cloths or moulds. Whey streams off a clear green river that will find a second life later. Weight is applied, time begins. Every region taught its own patience. In one valley, curds are cut fine and pressed hard, destined to live a year in a rind, as dignified as bark. In another, curds are ladled, soft, salted, lightly meant to be eaten within days, a moon's food rather than a year's. Salt is not flavour here so much as law. It tells the water to leave, tells the microbes to behave, tells the rind to form a skin that moths and mischief cannot cross. Wheels are rubbed with brine, turned on schedules that feel like prayer. Monday to the left, Thursday to the right. A ritual of wrists that keeps moisture travelling, keeps moulds beautiful instead of murderous. Cellars matter. A good cheese room holds 99 secrets and shares them with anyone who will visit daily with a cloth and a sense of weather. Stone and earth do what no recipe can. They keep cool not by numbers, but by mood. Monasteries excelled at this because patience is their major crop. A monk with a ledger that records the turning of wheels is very near to a scientist, even if his ink is prayer thick. When famine visits the village, a string of wheels on wooden planks looks like a row of lanterns that will not go out. Whey, the cheerful exile of cheesemaking, refuses to be waste. It sours into a drinkable tang that can calm a stomach that has known too much bark bread. It thickens porridges. It softens doughs that would otherwise sulk. It feeds pigs that will in honest time feed people back. The economy of survival loves a circle. In some houses, a pot of whey simmers down to a brown sweet concentrate, a candied echo of milk used to bribe children through thin winters. No one calls it dessert. No one needs to. Fermentation is preservation's cousin and tutor. Cabbage becomes sauerkraut by a grammar so simple it sounds like cheating shred salt pack weight. Salt draws water from the leaves. The brine excludes the wrong guests and invites the right ones. The right ones, tiny nameless workers we will one day call lactic acid bacteria, eat sugar no tongue can taste and leave lactic acid which every tongue recognizes as safety and appetite. A crock under a cloth on a cool floor becomes a factory that hums without smoke or sermons. Kraut tastes of patience and proof. It brings scurvy's enemy to a table that has forgotten green. Pickles expand the method into a gallery of jars. Turnips, beets, onions, wild greens from hedgerows. Each learns to live in vinegar or brine. The choice between acid made by men, vinegar brewed from ale or wine, and acid made by microbes, lactic brine, is less important than the constancy with which the jar is kept from air and arguments. A pickled shelf is a row of small victories. Children count jars the way other children count coins. They know exactly when a household is safe enough to tell a story before sleep without inventing a happy ending. Fish submit to preservation with dignity when treated promptly. Salted herring layered with crystals that bite and bless travel inland, in barrels that smell like labour and wealth arranged in a spiral. Dried cod stiffens into boards that require a mallet and a plan. Rehydrated and simmered with onions and generosity, it becomes proof that water can be put back into the past. Smokehouses turn oily fish into winter's shadows, flavours that coat the mouth with the memory of fires that were tended well. A good smoke is not a haze, it is a thread thin and clean that binds fish to February. Meat behaves under salt and smoke and acid as well, though the poor meat rarely. When a pig is killed, nothing that can be persuaded to keep is allowed to die a second time. Hams are rubbed, hung, and dreamed about. Sausages are taught to resist rot by curing salts. A village knows without wording. Dried, they become red. Ropes of occasion, cut thin and savoured loud. Offal that cannot be kept is kept in recipes, blood given starch, and steam to become puddings that ignore the day of the week when calendars demand fasting. The line between piety and hunger is thin. Preservation makes it negotiable. Grain, too, is not helpless. It keeps best in dry clean bins that rats cannot audit. But in damp years sprouting is treason. Kilns answer with warm, dry air that halts the coup and gives malt to brewers and porridge to breakfasts that like a little toast in their morning. Malt is preservation and preparation at once, an ambiguity any practical person will choose when options are few. Small beer weak ale brewed because water is a rumour rather than a certainty, stores calories in a liquid that argues less with the gut than a raw well. But that is the next part's concern. Here we notice that brewing is a way to carry grain through time. Preservation grows institutions. Monasteries were pantries with bells. They kept rules and rations, wheels and barrels, ledgers and consciences. In tight years, they opened doors and measured out mercy in ladles, slices, and mugs. Not every monastery was kind. Not every abbot understood that charity is stored food's highest purpose. But enough did for the reputation to stick. Villagers queued with bowls and humility, and sometimes with defiance. Monks counted and learned new math. A community that can portion out scarcity without losing itself is practicing governance of the stomach, which is the strictest politics of all. At home, the cellar was a family's biography. Hooks from rafters, shelves of coarse wood, a cool corner married to the north wall. Shelves furred with white bloom where cheeses aged. Jars whose lids were tied with cloth and hope. The smell was complicated. Acid animal wood, and a low, sweet note from fruit that had been dried and tucked in linen. To descend with a candle was to ask the past for help. To come back up with an onion in brine, a chip of cheese, and 2 pickled beets was to give the evening a different ending than it would have had. Preservation had rules that felt like proverbs. Keep salt dry, and salt will keep you. Trust what sinks, question what floats. Turn what needs turning, on a day you will remember. Do not ask vinegar to be kind, ask it to be thorough. Save the starter, check the crock, protect from air and from men with knives at night. If mold is white and smells of mushroom and clean cellars, wipe and carry on. If it is black or green and smells of regret, begin again. These laws were not written, but they were enforced by outcomes, which is the fairest court. What did these preserved miracles give besides longevity? They gave predictability, and with predictability comes a tenderness toward tomorrow. A household with 3 wheels of cheese and a row of jars can plan speech promises to children arrangements, with neighbours, a wedding pushed not to next year but only to spring. They also gave variety to a winter that otherwise tastes like monotony. A sour note here, a salty bite there, a fatty calm from a sliver of ham hocked into a cabbage pot. These are the arguments the tongue uses to persuade the heart that life is not only endurance. And there was a subtler gift knowledge stored in flavour. Cabbage that has fermented rightly teaches the nose what safe acid smells like. Cheese teaches the fingers how much bounce is readiness. A well-salted fish teaches the eye the exact glisten between raw and ruined. Children raised among these jars and wheels inherit a library with no pages. In famine, years that library is lighter to carry than any book and more immediately useful than any sermon. Preservation is not triumph. It is a truce with time negotiated, daily sealed with salt and patience. The salt must be bought or boiled from pans by the sea. The patience must be grown at home where tempers are shorter than winters. Yet, the result is astonishing food that waits without sulking, that makes February less an enemy and more a neighbour with odd hours. In the lives of the poor miracles, rarely arrive as surprises. They arrive as methods repeated until they look like ordinary work. Cheese on a shelf, cabbage in a crock, fish in smoke. A door that opens when hunger knocks, and a hand that measures out enough. Thirst is a quieter tyrant than hunger, but it is no gentler. A person can negotiate with bread, slice it thinner, make it last. Water is blunt. In years when the well tasted of doubt, and the stream ran through the tannery's gossip before it reached the village, the poor learned a set of liquid arts, brewing that tamed water broths that carried food where teeth and coin could not, and the use of blood and bone to turn scarcity into something drinkable. These were the liquids of life served in wooden cups and earthen bowls, as practical as rope and as intimate as breath. Begin with small beer, the household's daily peace treaty with the unseen world. It was not a festival drink. It was closer to a food group, a thin ale brewed low and safe low in strength, so children could drink it without turning afternoons into mistakes safe, because boiling and fermentation had humiliated the microbes that liked to lurk in. Water. The method was a choreography learned by hands rather than books. Warm the mash of crushed grain. Hold the heat where starches convert. Let the sweet liquid wort run clear. Boil cool pitch yesterday's yeast. Then wait while the quiet workers change sugar into breath and a little fire. Bubbles in the alewife's bucket were punctuation marks in a sentence about safety. The end result tasted of cereal and housekeeping and a small rightness in a day that had offered few. Households brewed in cycles that matched labour. A mash on Monday, a boil by evening yeast on Tuesday, transfer on Thursday, and by Sabbath there was something that slid down and soothed. The trub yeast and grain lees at the bottom was not waste. It thickened soups or fed pigs that would later redeem the investment. Hops were not universal, but where they were known, they lent bitterness and a preservative sternness. Where they were not herbs, alehoof yarrow horehound played the role of bitterness with their own accents. Brewing was chemistry without glassware. The thermometer was the back of a hand on a warm pot. The hydrometer was the experience of yesterday. Small beer did more than hydrate. It carried calories to bodies busy mending fences, or minds busy counting the season's risks. A cup could serve as a small breakfast when bread was uncooperative. It quieted infants with its gentle sweetness and made old people honest about sleep. And it policed the day not by law, but by custom. A household with beer knew when to stop arguing and start ladling. There is a diplomacy in shared cups that courts still try to imitate with polished metal. Alongside beer lived the broth, which is simply water that has been taught to work. Bones and rinds, aging roots and cabbage stumps, things that do not present well on a plate become in water. A kindness that bodies quickly understand. A pot of broth on the hearth turned a kitchen into a hospital without pomp. People who had eaten too much bark bread, who felt the faintness that comes from full stomachs with no strength in them, could drink their way back to steadier hands. Salt, when it could be spared, made a false summer in the mouth. A little verjuice or vinegar let the tongue wake up and told the stomach that this was nourishment, not punishment. There were broths for different hours. Morning broths were pale, worked with oats or barley, into something that made a scythe feel lighter by noon. Evening broths were darker, long cooked the liquid version of perseverance. On days when the ox had been generous, or a pig had been cut, a ribbon of fat melted into the ladle, gave a silk that felt like forgiveness. Even on fish days when calendars demanded abstention from hooves and hair, a fish head worked with patience, could make a clear soup that taught the tongue to be grateful for subtlety. Then there is blood, a word that makes modern ears hesitate and medieval kitchens nod. Blood is dense with what the body needs and will not apologize for it. Used fresh, salted quickly, and cooked with grain, it became black pudding, a sausage that slices like bread and eats like supper. Used in the pot with a little acid to set it, it thickened a broth into seriousness, turning something sippable into something that asked you to sit down. No one toasted with blood. No one bragged. It was not pageantry. It was efficiency. When a family slaughtered the bowl set aside, for blood was the opposite of waste. In hard months, a cup of blood soup could be the difference between standing through Vespers and sitting down in the doorway before the bell had finished. Religions write rules that hunger edits. Fast days and lean seasons overlapped often enough that a practical theology developed. Fish permitted, eels counted as fish by traditions. Willing to forgive amphibians, their amphibiousness, almond milk, as a festival luxury for those who could buy nuts or thyme. But the poor wrote their own commentary in the kitchen way, used to soften porridge on a Friday. Oil hoarded for a Lenten pot, where a shred of salted herring could perfume 3 bowls. A stew so studiously meatless that it felt holy even if it was simply honest. The line between piety and necessity blurred in steam. Sprouted grain crossed that line, carrying virtue in its small green flags. When oats or barley were allowed to sprout, then dried gently, they brought a sweeter, friendlier flavour to brews and porridges, and a whisper of nutrients to bodies that recognized the kindness, even if they could not name it. Malt, that deliberate half-life of grain, gave small beer its small cheer, and morning gruel its faint suggestion of feast. In a year with too much damp-kilning sprouted grain was rescue. In any year, it was useful. Not all liquids were swallowed because of nutrition. Some were made for the soul. Posset's milk curdled lightly with ale or wine, set with spice, when spice could be begged or stolen from a richer cupboard, were often medicine in name, comfort in fact. A mother after childbirth, a grandfather after a long wet day, a child with a cough, everyone knew by its sound, each might meet a warm cup at the end of a bench and feel seen. The spice could be nothing but a bruise of sage. The effect was still theatre in the service of health. The house had performed competence, and bodies being suggestible often agreed. Safety threaded through all of this. Water brought from the stream could be briefly boiled, even if it was destined for beer later. Vessels were scalded in turn, wooden cups were scrubbed with salt, when salt existed with ash, when it did not. Straining through clean linen clean, in the sense that it had been boiled to humility, kept sand and worse out of teeth and guts. Children learned early that a bubbling pot was not noise, but grammar water that sings, is water that has forgotten some dangers. The tools of the liquid kitchen were as plain as faith. A mash tun could be a tub. A stirring paddle could be a branch shaved and sanded until it felt like a rule. Ladles were heirlooms. Cracks were mended with pitch or replaced with a neighbour's kindness. A coil of rope and a cool corner were a brewery on a hot day. A three-legged cauldron over an honest bed of coals was a pharmacy without a Latin label. The skill lay in the sequence and the attention, not the apparatus. There were failures, batches that soured wrong beers, that refused to start broths, that turned mean because a bone had gone over to the enemy in the barrel. A household that brewed steadily learned to recognize the wrong smell as quickly as a mother knows a fever by a warm forehead. They learned triage, throw it out before it throws you down. Start again, do not cry over spilt. Wart crying takes water, and they learned to share. A good brew day produced more than one house could use before it faded. A neighbour's empty bucket is an invitation. At table, liquids made motion possible. A cup of small beer and a bowl of broth could send a person back to the field, the forest, or the shore with less complaint from muscles and mind. Children, fed by spoon in laps, learned that the world meant to keep them. Old people, with more stories than teeth, could continue to eat what the family ate, because the family ate foods that could be drunk. Even arguments softened. It is hard to shout with a warm bowl in your hands. The liquids of life are not noble. They do not strut, they carry. They make the hard food of the world soluble and the hard facts of the world bearable. In a winter that had already asked too much, the sound of a pot coming to a boil or the sight of a line of cups on a bench was an answer. Not a grand one, not enough to change the weather, but enough to change a body, to warm it, to steady it, to remind it that while the sky could be cruel, the hearth could be kind, and kindness served hot and shared is its own nutrition. Hunger teaches arithmetic. 1 loaf divided by 6 mouths equals noise. But villages learned another kind of math. 1 pot, many hands, and a discipline that multiplies what it touches. When harvests failed, people did not only turn inward, they turned toward each other building systems that were part custom, part conscience, and part choreography. Community in such years was not a sentiment. It was infrastructure. Begin with the shared pot. On ordinary feast days, A communal cauldron is celebration. In lean seasons, it is policy. A single fire for 50 bowls saves wood, which is food in another form. A single pot concentrates flavor that would vanish across many hearths. The bone that barely speaks in a small pan will testify in a vat. The handful of barley from each household becomes a texture that feels like abundance when stirred together. The rules of the pot are as strict as any law. The first ladle goes to elders, whose hands shake the second to small children who grow, while others wait then to the weak, then to those who carried wood and water, and finally to the one who was stirred. Behind the order is an ethic usefulness, is honored vulnerability, is protected. Fuel scarcity shapes the logistics. Fires are built in a wind-sheltered corner of the churchyard, or manor court stones set to cradle the cauldron. Women mind the simmer, while men cut kindling, to length no waste, no show. Bread arrives in trenches to sop the broth, saving bowls for those who have none. A child is given the job of counting spoons another, of rinsing them with hot water between servings, because hygiene is not a luxury when one sickness can unravel a plan. There is pride in these roles. The small become necessary, and necessity is dignity. Around the pot forms a web of reciprocity that predates coins and survives them. A widow offering a jar of dried bilberries earns a place on tomorrow's list for extra soup. A man with strong back but no grain pledges 3 days mending fences in payment for 1 basket of nettles. None of it is written, and all of it is remembered. Reputation is a pantry. A family that hoards in public will find themselves alone in future hungry summers. A family that gives until it hurts will never lack hands at harvest or shoulders at funerals. The village keeps books in its bones. Some cooperation had legal names. After the harvest, gleaning rights allowed the poor, particularly widows and orphans, to walk the fields and gather what the sickle left behind. It was mercy turned into method acknowledged by lords who understood that a small loss on a ledger prevented a larger loss in streets. The gleaner's day is long, and bowed eyes on stubble hands quick. A basket of fallen heads of grain is not charity, it is earnings under a sky that has already cheated. Elsewhere in the oak and beechwood's pannage, the right to turn pigs loose in mast season converted forest into bacon and hope. Families pooled animals and labour. One boy watches the herd. One girl marks trees where acorns fall heaviest. An elder sits on a stump and counts snouts at dusk. Pork salted in brine is a community calendar hung in the cellar. The commons, meadows, heaths, woodlots, ponds held in shared use were the village's insurance policy. Not paradise, they needed governance. A stint limited how many animals each household could graze. A wood reeve counted bundles of brushwood. A haywood watched the meadows and had a voice sharp enough to turn a scythe. These offices were not grand, but they kept scarcity from becoming theft. In famine years, rules tightened. No cutting live timber, no grazing before, a date that protected roots, no netting the pond on Sundays. Enforcement was communal and therefore personal. You did not cross the Hayward. You shared bread with him. Rotating kitchens appeared when fuel or hands were especially short. 3 households took turns hosting the pot for a week, each pooling ingredients and labour. The others fetched water, chopped, tended children, mended nets. The host kept the dripping jar, and the last onion ends not payment, but practicality. Meanwhile, a spinning ring or mending circle gathered near the fire, while the soup looked after itself. Fingers repaired clothes, and tongues repaired courage. Work aligned like dovetail joints. Nothing was wasted, not even despair. Charity had institutions and faces. Monasteries measured out wheels of cheese casks, of small beer, and barrels of salted fish by tally notches on hazel rods that matched between giver and receiver at settlement. Parish chests released coin for peat or shoes when numbers of bare feet at the pot began to rise. Some lords opened granaries, calculating correctly that the price of mercy was lower than the cost of rebellion. Others learned the geometry of pitchforks. The village saw and remembered. Leadership is a kind of food. It must be digested later in votes of trust work given or withheld. Rationing emerged as a craft. The potkeeper kept a slate of mouths and measures, sometimes using tokens, pebbles, or wooden tallies, so no one ladled twice while others waited. This was not meanness. It was mathematics in defense of morale. A fair line is more nourishing than a generous scramble. Children learn to stand in order without turning the act into humiliation. The line itself became a lesson hunger is common. Therefore, we are too. Resource sharing extended beyond food. Firewood walks sent crews into hedges to gather deadfall and pollard willow under rules that kept trees alive. Water brigades rotated trips to the cleanest spring. 2 men repaired the leaky bucket, a third retarred the yoke. Tool libraries existed in practice. If not in name, a scythe was borrowed with thanks and returned honed. A pot was traded for a day's weeding. The glue that held this all together was witness people saw what others did, and that seeing had force. Invisibility is a modern luxury. The community also invented quiet exemptions. A mother nursing twins was served early. A man whose hands shook was given a job that kept dignity. A watcher of the fire's edge, a teller of time by prayer lengths. A girl who could not walk well supervised toddlers a queen on a stool with jurisdiction over scraped knees. The strong took the heavy buckets and pretended it was nothing. In scarcity, a village's real theology shows who is first, who is last, and whether the list can change. There were arguments because there are always arguments where fairness is precious. Why did that household receive a double ladle? Because they brought the only bone. Why is the haywood strict? Because grass grows back if you give it the chance. Why must we turn the cauldron clockwise 3 times with the long spoon before serving? Because someone's grandmother proved to herself it helped, and rituals are scaffolds of sanity. Not every explanation satisfies, but most practices carry enough truth to keep the structure standing until spring. Markets did not vanish. They moved closer to the heart. Barter days replaced coin when coin ran out eggs against onions, a day mending harness against a sack of oats, a lesson in identifying safe mushrooms against the loan of a pig for pannage. The church porch became an exchange words and goods passing under carved saints who knew more about hunger than their stone faces suggested. Deals were sealed not with signatures, but with witnessed promises. I will come when called. We will share when the net is full. Defaulting on such a promise was not a breach of contract. It was a collapse of belonging. Safety lived in numbers. Night watches grew thicker, near granaries and near the weir, when fish were running, because one theft can unravel a plan spun by a dozen patient days. A lantern's slow swing around the churchyard signalled that someone was awake for everyone. Songs held the tempo of the watch verses about saints and seasons about hounds that do and do not bark about wheat, that will be tall again because the people guarding its future choose to believe what they are singing. What did all this yield time? The most precious outcome of communal systems was not a full belly. Few bellies were truly full, but more days strung together without catastrophe. Time for the next shipment of salt fish to arrive. Time for the nettles to flush again. Time for a pig to add a little more weight before slaughter. Time for tempers to cool so that tomorrow's work could be done without old words getting in the way. in scarcity time is a currency minted collectively, and it yielded memory the good kind that makes the next famine less ignorant. Children who watched the line form and the pot stir understood the grammar of fairness before they learned to write. Teenagers who carried wood and found it heavy learned why the rule about a single fire matters. Elders who received the first bowl for months remembered which lord opened the granary and which pretended not to hear the knocking. When the weather forgave them, the village did not forget itself. Community, then, was not a romance in the mist. It was a series of specific acts done at specific hours by people who could not afford to be exquisite about their motives. The shared pot, the gleaned field, the pigs under oaks, the tokens in a bowl, the Hayward's sharp voice, the monk with a ledger and a ladle, the widow's bilberries swapped for a week of wood. Each of these is a rung on a ladder built sideways, across to your neighbour, rather than upward to a throne of plenty. You cross on it, and you do not look down. Spring will come, bread will be heavy again. But it is the bridge made of us that gets us there. Spring does not apologize. It arrives the way it always does. Sap rising in the hedges, fatness returning to the light, a faint green rumour moving across fields like handwriting relearning itself. The first mornings when bread is heavy again, there is laughter in kitchens that does not sound like laughter yet. It sounds like wood on wood boards, set down bowls, placed a knife-meeting crust that yields properly. Relief is not joy at first, it is competence restored. People count. Counting is the first sacrament after scarcity. How many sacks in the loft? How many jars left from the cellar? How many hands at the table today? Compared with last year, the arithmetic is tender and blunt. Where a chair is empty, bread does not taste the same. Where a chair holds a new child, the pot feels larger. Hunger changes the scale of everything. After hunger, people keep the new scale for a while, unable to trust that abundance means what it says. The land itself records what happened. Fallow strips that were forced into service have scars of hurried ploughing. Hedges show where kindling was clipped too closely in January and was merciful in March. Fish weirs need repairs in the precise places where tired hands cut corners. The village walks its perimeter like a seamstress inspecting stitches. There is muttering and there is praise. A field that held back erosion because someone insisted on a grass border is spoken of by name as if the meadow itself had earned a virtue. Laws wake up differently after a famine. Some are written, most are customary, and therefore live in throats and eyebrows. The assize on bread may be enforced with more kindness scales checked with a small nod rather than a performance. Gleaning rules are repeated in church, not with the tone of mercy, but with the tone of maintenance. This is how we keep next winter from being worse. Commons governance tightens where it was too loose, loosens where it was too tight. A Hayward who was harsh to save grass is thanked reluctant warm, a Reeve who winked at fence. Mending schedules learns that leniency can be expensive. Law is not a cudgel here. It is a memory tool. Households adjust their private constitutions. A dripping jar is kept more faithfully, its lid tied with a bit of cloth that has become an amulet. A mother who learned 3 ways to leach acorns writes them into her children's hands with practice rather than ink. Once a month, even in a good year, she makes acorn cakes just because, and no one pretends not to understand the liturgy. A father who begged a starter culture for kraut when cabbage was scarce now keeps a crock like a pet fed and checked with a behaviour that softly admits insurance. Markets return, but not quite the same. Barter days become coin days again, yet the habit of witnessed promises lingers. I will come when called keeps its force, because the village remembers when call and answer were the only currency left. Bakers bake with real wheat and still slice old bread for sops as if to keep conversations going with yesterday. Alewives brew stronger again, and yet a tub of small beer bubbles in the corner because no one trusts wells just because they choose to. Famine teaches backups. Abundance does not unteach them quickly. The stories ripen. Children hear tales told in a new key cautionary woods, where siblings survive by wit houses made of sugar that promise relief and deliver lesson pots that never empty if you don't ask the wrong question. These are not courtly romances. They are instructions dressed as wonder. A grandmother pauses in a story to emphasize the sentence about leaving seed for next time. A grandfather hums the chorus of the field-working song that kept breath and pace during the leanest haymaking. The tune glues to memory better than sermon. Folklore is farm work written in metaphor. Faith also shifts its furniture. Processions for rain resume, and processions for the stopping of rain too. But the village now understands that prayer is not plumbing. Priests preach about providence. Parishioners nod and remember the monk with a ledger and a ladle. Gratitude is offered not as payment, but as posture. Candles are lit for lost neighbours. Not all names are spoken aloud, but all are present. In years to come, when weather is gentle, people will still walk a certain path to a certain spring and dip cups only after a small silence. Rituals become more local, more precise. God is large, wells are specific. The young who carried wood and counted spoons grow into officials. A boy who learned how to coil rope properly so a net would not snarl becomes the man who keeps the weir. A girl who kept toddlers safe by the communal fire becomes the woman who organizes rotating kitchens with the calm authority of someone who has watched pots decide the fate of arguments. Expertise is ancestry. Election by competence, disguised as custom, improves the odds for everyone without sounding like a revolution. Crafts adapt. Coopers sharpen their practice because barrels are biographies. Good staves mean winter has a decent story. Millers adjust stones for chestnut again when mast promises well. No one sneers at the job the way they might have before the bad year. The saltpan keeper, who learned a better way to rake crystals without losing brine to wind, shares the trick with a cousin upriver without charging coin. A gratitude economy is not sentiment. It is survival's habit rediscovered under easier skies. Not all legacies are gentle. Distrust lingers in corners of a lord who opened late of a neighbour who lined up early with 2 bowls when the rule was 1. Such names are not spoken often, but they are consulted when favours are asked. Hunger is a historian with a mean pen, its footnotes are faces, and yet the village decides most of the time to prefer usefulness to vengeance. A person who is selfish but is strong may be assigned the heaviest tasks. It is not forgiveness exactly, but it is a therapy that benefits the patient and the ward alike. Bodies remember differently than minds. A hand that trembled all winter steadies only by midsummer. A stomach that shrank does not trust feasts. People go to bed earlier for a while, even when the evenings are kind. Children at first squirrel bits of bread under mattresses the way squirrels squirrel. Parents let it pass, retrieving the stash later with a kiss and a joke. You do not argue directly with fear. You place your hand on its shoulder and walk with it to the table. The earth, too, has its therapies. Fields are given rest on purpose, not only by necessity. The parish sets a festival for planting on a day that avoids the saints who were unlucky last time. Men dig ditches with more intention because they remember water in places where it did not belong. Women sow kitchen gardens with the obstinate knowledge that herbs change broth as surely as law changes markets. The village learns to carry 2 truths at once, Next year might be kind. Next year might be cruel. Preparedness becomes piety. In the mellow evenings of the first forgiving summer, there are meals that feel like proper meals. A wheel of cheese is cut without arithmetic nerve. Kraut is forked from a crock without counting jars on a shelf. A fish is eaten on the day it was caught, simply because it would be a shame not to taste the sea when the sea is willing. Gratitude takes on texture. It is not general. It is specific. This onion, this loaf, this bowl, this neighbour. The way light pools on a table is as nourishing as the soup because it says you are here, and so is everyone else who is meant to be. What remains once the fields have forgiven and the cellars are modestly smug again is continuity, not triumph. Triumph is for generals and songs. Continuity is for villages. It is a road through winter that people keep swept by habit, the shared pot, the kept starter, the counted spoons, the remembered rule about acorns, the weir checked before dawn, the Hayward's voice, the monk's ledger, the drip of brine from a ham. That means October will not frighten us as much. Continuity is not drama. It is a door that opens when you push it all year. Years later, when children ask about the bad season, adults answer without poetry, we did what needed doing. But the children hear the music anyway. They hear it in the cadence of a recipe, in the order of a ration line, in a grandmother's habit of turning a cheese on Mondays and Thursdays, as if gravity were a liturgy. And if some future year the sky forgets kindness again, the village will say the old words and perform the old steps. Hunger taught them a dance. After the hunger, they keep practicing, not out of fear, but because knowing the steps is a form of peace. You've just walked through another forgotten corner of the past, not the world of kings or saints, but the quieter country where most of humanity has always lived. The small rooms, the muddy fields, the faith that bends but doesn't break. These are the places where history truly breathes. Here at Poor Historian, we don't chase the noise of glory. We listen for the whispers, the sound of a wooden spoon scraping the last meal from a pot. The hush before a bell tolls the breath of someone still alive after everyone richer has gone. The poor never wrote their stories, so we try to lend them a voice slow and steady, the way truth prefers to travel. If you've stayed this long, perhaps something in those voices found you. Maybe you recognized a little of yourself in their endurance, the quiet act of getting up again, of doing the work that no one will ever sing about. That's what this channel exists for, to remind us that survival is not small, that dignity can live in the dirt, and that memory is the gentlest kind of rebellion. Take a moment before you go. Let the sound of their world fade but not vanish. Picture the candlelight softening the corners of a cottage, or the hush that follows when the last tool is put away. Those lives are long gone, but their echoes are patient. They wait for anyone willing to listen without hurry. If you want to keep walking these narrow paths of the past, the ones that smell of smoke, sweat, and stories, you can help them stay lit. Subscribe to Poor Historian and let history find you when the world gets too loud. Leave a comment if a scene or a sentence stayed with you. That's how we keep these voices alive. And if this journey brought you a little calm, a little wonder, or just a better kind of silence, share it. Someone else might need that stillness too. There are more lives waiting here. Peasants, healers, builders, soldiers, mothers, ordinary souls who made the Middle Ages anything but dull. Their stories don't demand attention, they earn it. Each one is another piece of the great mosaic of how we got here, not through brilliance or conquest, but through persistence. So as you close your eyes or drift into sleep, remember this history isn't only what was written, it's what was endured. And somewhere, in the dust between centuries, the poor are still telling their stories, softly, stubbornly, gratefully, to anyone willing to listen. Thanks for listening, for remembering, and for keeping company with the forgotten. We'll meet again in the next quiet story.